The Balanced Scorecard, a discipline for making sure the executive is being measured against the strategy the board has actually adopted, and not against the one that happens to be easiest to count. 1992. Robert Kaplan of Harvard Business School and David Norton published the Balanced Scorecard, measures that drive performance in the Harvard Business Review. The observation, now familiar and then not, was this: financial metrics alone, return on equity, earnings per share, total shareholder return, measure the past. They tell the board whether the strategy worked last year. They cannot tell the board whether the strategy is working now. For that, a board needs measures that lead, not measures that lag. Kaplan and Norton proposed four perspectives, balanced against each other: financial for the shareholder, customer for the market position, internal process for the operating engine, learning and growth for the capability that creates future value. Four perspectives, for each objective measures, for each measure targets, for each target initiatives. The grammar is deliberate. The board is not telling the executive what to do. It is telling the executive what will be examined, against what benchmark, at what cadence. What gets measured changes what gets done. Kaplan and Norton's claim, proved repeatedly in the 3 decades since, is that strategy lives in the scorecard. Change the scorecard and you change the strategy, whether the strategy document gets rewritten or not. The methodological origin is worth pausing on. 1994, Mobile US Marketing and Refining. A business that had lost money for years under a scorecard tilted almost entirely to financial metrics. Brian Baker and the senior team worked with Kaplan and Norton to build a scorecard that rebalanced towards customer and internal process measures. The customer perspective named the target consumer, the road warrior who valued speed, friendly service, and clean facilities, and ranked the segments accordingly. The internal process perspective tied operational excellence to specific service station behaviors. The learning and growth perspective tracked the strategic competencies that closed the capability gap. Within 3 years, Mobile USM&R had moved from worst to first in its peer group on profitability per gallon. The Mobile case and the chemical bank case that followed were the empirical backbone of Kaplan and Norton's 1996 book, Translating Strategy into Action. Most boards using a balanced scorecard today are using a descendant of the design Kaplan and Norton first specified against Mobile's specific operational reality. Mobile is the foundational positive. The framework began as a successful intervention, not a theoretical proposal. 2000. Kaplan and Norton published the strategy-focused organization, naming an additional discipline: the strategy map, a visualization of the cause and effect chains that link learning and growth investments to internal process improvements, those to customer experience outcomes, and those in turn to financial performance. The strategy map answered the most common implementation failure: scorecards that listed measures without explaining how they were supposed to connect. The map made the implicit theory of value creation explicit. The board could now ask of any measure what it was contributing to the chain. Here is the argument the rest of this note will make. The balanced scorecard is the instrument through which strategy becomes operational, or fails to. The board that reads the scorecard reads the strategy. The board that does not read the scorecard, no matter how many strategy documents it commissions, is reading press releases. And by the end of this note, the scorecard turns out to be the closest thing a board has to a leading indicator of its own future strategy, roughly 12 months ahead of any strategy document the executive will publish. That last claim is the analytical move this note proposes, and BP and Hilty, in opposite directions, will demonstrate the point. First, the case. BP. The earlier notes in this room have established the timeline. Note 09 on Freeman's stakeholder theory sets out Bernard Looney's net zero commitment in February 2020 and the August 2020 strategy day, at which a 40% cut in oil and gas production by 2030 was specified. That target was moderated to 25% in February 2023. Looney left in September 2023. Murray Auchincloss, his chief financial officer, became permanent chief executive in January 2024. In February 2025, Auchincloss announced what BP called a fundamental reset, raising oil and gas capital expenditure, cutting renewables spend, and withdrawing the production cut target altogether. Note, 09 reads the reset as a stakeholder coalition redraw. Note 10, on Mendelow's matrix, reads it as a stakeholder map in motion. Note 11, on agency and stewardship, reads it as the board switching governance theses under activist pressure. This note reads the same reset through a fourth instrument, the executive scorecard. And what the scorecard reveals is that the reset was visible in BP's own remuneration design, 2 reporting cycles before it was visible anywhere else. BP has used a balanced scorecard style design for executive pay for more than a decade, organized under bespoke strategic headings that map functionally onto Kaplan and Norton's 4 perspectives: financial, operating cash flow, capital discipline, distributions; customer, customer-facing brand and operational reliability; internal process, safety performance, operational emissions, project delivery; learning and growth, capability and lower carbon technologies; workforce development, diversity and inclusion. Each weighted, each reported in the annual remuneration report, each tied to the long-term incentive plan. Trace the weight changes year by year. In the 2021 remuneration report, the first after Looney's net zero pledge, the learning and growth perspective carried approximately 1/3 of the scorecard, with transition capability metrics explicit and load-bearing. By the 2023 report, that weight had drifted quietly downward. By the 2024 report, it had drifted further. By the 2025 report, the first under Auchincloss, the balance had shifted materially towards the financial perspective. Operating cash flow and distributions, taken together, carried more weight than the entire learning and growth dimension. The precise percentages matter less than the direction of travel. The directional movement across 4 successive remuneration reports is the empirical record. The reset was already happening on the page of the remuneration report. The reset did not begin in February 2025. It began in the Remuneration Committee 2 years earlier. When the scorecard shifted, the strategy shifted. What the executive was being paid to deliver changed before any capital decision was announced. The external pressure mapped onto that internal shift in close succession. Bluebell Capital Partners, January 2024. Letter to Chair Helga Lund made the scorecard redrawing argument publicly. Elliott Management's reported 5% stake, taken in the weeks before the February 2025 announcement, gave it teeth. Note 11 sets out the activist pressure in full. The point for this note is narrower. By the time the activist names became public, the scorecard had already been rebalancing for 2 reporting cycles. The board that can read its own scorecard can read its own future strategy roughly 12 months before the strategy is written. This is also the point at which the scorecard crosscuts Mintzberg's 5 Ps in Note 21. Mintzberg's pattern is strategy as observed in retrospect, the consistency of behavior over time, stripped of what the organization says it does. The scorecard is the pattern made measurable. It is the closest thing a board has to a quantitative trace of its own strategic pattern, because pay design is one of the few corporate artifacts the executive cannot easily contradict in practice. Pay drives behavior. Behavior is the pattern. The scorecard is therefore both the diagnostic and the leading indicator. A board that reads only the strategy document is reading the plan. A board that reads the scorecard is reading the pattern. The contemporary positive contrast. Hilti AG, the Liechtenstein-based family-owned construction tools group, founded in 1941 and held by the Martin Hilti Family Trust. Hilti has run a continuously refreshed scorecard since the late 90s. The Hilti scorecard is unusual in 2 specific ways the BP case helps make legible. First, the customer perspective is not merely measured, it is owned by name by a member of the executive board, with quarterly reviews chaired by the chief executive against named customer segments. The customer perspective has an executive owner who can be held to it. Second, the learning and growth perspective tracks specific managerial competency gaps identified in succession planning and tied to a multi-year executive development pipeline. The pipeline is the measure. Recruitment, retention, and capability are tracked against it. Hilti's scorecard does not float. It is anchored in operational decisions the board can verify. The point of the contrast for our purposes is not the share price or the macro execution. It is the stewardship of the scorecard itself. The same instrument used at BP and at Hilti produces different governance behaviors because the discipline behind the instrument is different. The critique that holds. The balanced scorecard is a victim of its own success. Metrics become targets. Targets become games. The principle, often known in its popular form as Goodhart's Law, holds that any measure that becomes a target ceases to be a good measure. The BP case itself supplies the pattern. By 2023, BP's published transition capital expenditure figure was being aggregated in ways that flattered the scorecard target without producing the operating reality the scorecard was designed to encourage. Renewables operating capacity figures aggregated pipeline capacity alongside operating capacity, a measure that flattered the number without producing the gigawatt hours. The numbers satisfied the scorecard without producing the energy. Paul Niven, writing in 2006, argued that the balanced scorecard often drifts away from its original strategic purpose and becomes a performance management tool that the organization learns to optimize for without improving. Hannah Noriclit, writing in 2000, made the more methodological critique. The cause and effect chain Kaplan and Norton assume is more often a logical hypothesis than an empirical relationship. The honest answer is that every scorecard needs refreshing, and that the board's job is not to set the scorecard once, but to redesign it every 3 years against the strategy it actually wants to measure. Hilty's discipline of refreshing the scorecard against an updated strategy map is the operational answer to Niven's critique. BP's drift across 4 remuneration reports is the worked example of what Niven warned about in real time on the public record. As of May 2026, the BP scorecard is, more than any press release, the live artifact of the reset. The 2026 remuneration report is being drafted now, and the 2027 scorecard will follow the chair succession that Helge Lund's April 2025 departure announcement set in motion. What moves in those 2 scorecards and how the long-term incentive plan is reweighted will tell the market which version of BP the new board has in post, well before any new strategy document confirms it. 3 things to carry forward. A reading, Robert Kaplan and David Norton, The Balanced Scorecard, Measures that Drive Performance, Harvard Business Review, January-February 1992. Their 1996 book, Translating Strategy into Action. The 2000 book, The Strategy-Focused Organization, for the Strategy Map Discipline. For the critique, Paul Niven, Balanced Scorecard Step by Step, 2006. The most operationally candid account of where scorecards fail, and Hannah Noriclit, The Balance on the Balanced Scorecard, in Management Accounting Research 2000, for the methodological case against the assumed cause and effect chain. For the worked positive examples, the Mobile USM&R case in Kaplan, and Norton's 1996 book, and the Hilty case in successive Palladium case publications. A question. Read your own organization's executive scorecard front to back. Which perspective is underweighted relative to the strategy the board is actually committed to, and who benefits from that underweighting, and the wider library? Freeman, in Note 09, names the stakeholder coalition the scorecard is supposed to serve. Mendelow, in Note 10, prioritizes the constituencies. Agency and stewardship, in Note 11, decides whose behavior the scorecard architecture is trying to govern. Mintzberg, in Note 21, gives the pattern of which the scorecard is the measurable trace. ESG, in Note 12, supplies the measurement language the scorecard puts into pay. The ideological argument in Note 14, shareholder primacy versus stakeholder capitalism, decides whose language gets weighted most heavily, and for what reason. And Section 172 of the Companies Act, in the Ethics Room's Note 02, is the statutory duty through which the regard the scorecard encodes is actually translated into director conduct. Each lens answers a different question about the same set of claims. The scorecard of all of them is the one that turns the answer into a number an executive will be paid against. Curated by Matthew Doyle. Made Partners.